I hope my report will serve as a wake-up call to all participants in the political process, not just the current government, but those who hope to be in government after the next election and beyond that.
When the three Lambies were elected to Parliament earlier this year and agreed to offer confidence and supply to the Liberal Party, they asked for an independent audit of Tasmania's state finances. Well, that report has been released this morning, and the author is independent economist Saul Eslake. He lays out clearly the trajectory of the state budget. More deficits, growing debt, and the consequences of the state remaining on an unsustainable trajectory will, according to Eslake, lead to a fiscal crisis for Tasmania if it continues unchecked. Saul Eslake, independent economist, good morning to you.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on your program.
You say the trajectory of the state's budget is unsustainable. In the simplest terms, can you explain to our listener what that means?
What it means is that if it continues on the path which it is now on and has been for some time, then we will reach a point where a government is forced to take drastic action to cut spending or raise taxes, or probably both, in order to forestall a dramatic increase in the interest rates that Tasmania has to pay on its borrowings, and potentially a refusal of lenders to buy the state government's bonds. Now, let me be clear. We don't have to end up there. We're not going to end up in that position in the next 2 or 3 years. It's where we might find ourselves if we keep going on as we have been for 10 years. My assumption is that we won't. And one of the purposes of this report is to encourage not just the government, but all of the participants in the political process, the opposition, minor parties and independent members of both houses of Parliament, to hopefully commit to at least a set of objectives that will prevent us reaching that state. And although there will inevitably be differences of opinion among political parties and independents as to precisely what should be done to forestall that scenario, that they'll nonetheless commit to supporting measures over more than the life of one parliament to prevent that sort of situation from unfolding.
What gives you confidence that we won't head towards the fiscal crisis? And I use air quotes there because they are your words in this report. What gives you confidence that we won't end up in the fiscal crisis that you say we've been on a trajectory for over the past decade?
Well, you can't be entirely confident. I mean, again, I want to be clear that the problems that Tasmania is, I think, facing can't be solved in the life of this parliament, but will need to be solved over a period of between 3 and 10 years. And that means that those who would like to be in government after the next election, as well as those who are currently in it, need to think very carefully about committing to strategies that will prevent a much worse situation from unfolding. And while inevitably they will disagree with some of the things that the government says, and the government will disagree with some of the things that its political opponents propose. And that's not just inevitable, but in a democracy, I think, desirable that there's a contest of ideas. Nonetheless, I think it's important that both the business community and individual Tasmanians can have confidence that whatever the outcome of the next 2 and 3 elections, whoever's in government will be doing things that forestall a worst-case scenario.
Saul Eslake's our guest this morning. You say the state, Saul, has 3 options: either raise more revenue, spend less money, which is cutting the budget, or sell something. Why is it in this report you prioritise revenue raising and taxation reform broadly as the pathway forward for Tasmania?
That's a really important question. I prioritise raising revenue over cutting operating expenses, that is, recurrent spending on services to the people. Firstly, because the analysis by the Grants Commission, which underpins the way in which Tasmania gets a bigger share of revenue from the GST than we would if it was cut up on a per capita basis, as the big states always argue, shows that Tasmania is already spending less than it would need to if it were to provide services at the same standard as the average of all states and territories. And that means that cutting spending would result in the services, hospitals, policing, schools, child protection, all those sorts of things, falling even further short of what other Australians living in different states and territories
So
receive.
that would be a bad idea. You talk briefly about the option of selling state infrastructure or assets.
Yeah, but let me sort of deal with the revenue side first. The same analysis from the Grants Commission says that Tasmania is collecting less revenue than it would if its tax and mineral royalty regimes were similar to the average of all the other states and territories, which suggests that there is more scope to raise revenue than there is to cut spending. What I'd also say is, given that most state taxes are levied on businesses and that those state taxes are deductible against federal company income tax, in effect, every dollar that's raised from additional tax on businesses, 30 cents effectively comes from Canberra. And to the extent that state taxes fall on individuals, and I'm suggesting that the scope to raise the amount of state tax paid by, for example, owners of highly valued property and purchasers and operators of expensive motor vehicles, then those increased taxes are likely to be funded in part by reducing saving rather than by reducing spending. So in principle, a dollar raised by raising revenues will have less of an impact on the state's economy than a dollar raised by cutting spending. As regards other areas of spending, I think there is scope to wind back the magnitude of the state government's infrastructure spending program.
So let's talk about that for a moment. You asked the question, how is it that we decide what we're going to spend on? And you suggest we're heading towards spending more per capita on infrastructure in Tasmania than any other state in the country. You then say that we need to have a much clearer view on what will be the most productive investment. I read that as a potential shot across the bows of the stadium and the $1 billion or more that all of the infrastructure around the stadium is going to cost the state. Are you suggesting that the stadium, given where we're at in the budget, might not be worth it right now?
No, I'm not. Remember that the part of the agreement between the Premier and the members of the Jacqui Lambie network was also to have an independent assessment of the business case for a stadium and for, as I understand it, other proposals for a stadium. And that review hasn't been published yet, so I certainly do not want to cut across whatever Nick Gruen might find about that. As I think I said to you before, my own views will be, heavily influenced by what Dr. Gruen eventually finds. But what I say about the infrastructure spending program, apart from observing that relative to the size of Tasmania's economy, it is the biggest of any state or territory, and I'm suggesting we can't afford that, however nice it might be to have it, that the infrastructure spending program has been constructed the wrong way. What ought to happen ideally is that the government should decide, with the advice of Treasury, how much Tasmania can afford to spend on infrastructure over a 10-year period and in each of the years within that 10-year period. And then having made that decision, it should select projects based on a ranking of their social and economic benefits relative to their costs. And when you're talking about social infrastructure, inevitably that will be a bit subjective and you sort of work your way down. Now, having made that recommendation, it would be wrong of me then to say, this project and that project should go ahead while these other ones shouldn't, without having seen any of that analysis, if indeed it's been undertaken. And in some cases, I have my doubts about that. So that's what I'm recommending there. But yes, I'm certainly saying that part of the solution to the problem is to step back from the spending program being as ambitious as it has become in recent years.
Your Mornings Around Tasmania, Saul Eslake is our guest this morning. A report delivered to our parliamentarians that was commissioned by the government, but at the request of the Jacqui Lambie network, and it'll be up online, no doubt. You'll be able to find it in the not too distant. Alex says via text this morning, Eslake always spruiks higher taxation that targets homeowners. Thank you, Alex, for the text this morning. Saul Eslake, you propose getting rid of stamp duty and introducing a very broad-based land tax that every landowner would pay, potentially with mainland and overseas investors paying even more. How hard do you think, or why are you so attracted to that as an idea? And what do you see as the political challenges of making it happen?
Well, yes, I certainly propose, as almost every review of taxation that's touched on state taxes in the last 30 years has proposed, that we replace stamp duties, which are a bad tax, with a more broadly based land tax, which, depending on your perspective, is either a good tax or the least worst kind of tax that you could propose. And in addition to the standard economic arguments for doing that, I also put in the report an equity argument which says this, that there's something fundamentally unfair about a property tax system which expects people who, for whatever reason, move houses 3 or 4 times in their life to contribute more to the cost of providing schools, hospitals, policing, child protection and the like than someone who sits in the same property for 40 years and just see its value go up, usually without any particular effort on their part, and contributes nothing to additional state revenue. Now, I'm suggesting that a broadly based land tax should have a threshold that exempts the lowest value homes. I'm suggesting that people who are, as they say, asset rich and income poor, like pensioners, should be able to defer any land tax.
So it just adds it becomes a bill that grows, and then when you eventually pass away, it's taken out of your estate.
And on the mainland, that's quite common for councils to do that with regard to municipal rates. I'm also suggesting that the surcharges which Tasmania, like other states, have in recent years imposed on foreign investors in residential real estate, that is, they pay higher stamp duty and land tax than domestic investors do, that should be extended to non-Tasmanian investors in residential property. I mean, what advantage is there to Tasmanians of having mainlanders buy up our properties so that Tasmanians wanting to buy their own homes can't do it if they're not themselves intending to move to Tasmania? I mean, I wouldn't want to do anything to discourage mainlanders from moving here, and I wouldn't want to discourage mainlanders from investing in new residential properties because that adds to housing supply. But why should the tax system not seek to discourage people who have no intention of living here from making it harder for Tasmanians to buy their own homes?
Your mornings around Tasmania. A listener says, what about a stadium levy? How would that go as an idea? Saul, stadium levy?
I'm not sure what's being proposed there. I mean, I guess if you want to make the stadium even more unpopular with those who are already opposed to it, putting a specific levy for the stadium would probably have that effect. That's not something I'm advocating, but nor am I saying that the revenue proposals that I've put are the only things that ought to be considered. I mean, I hope that my report might prompt other people with creative minds to come up with other options for raising additional revenue. But I do say that raising additional revenue would be better for Tasmania in solving this problem than seeking to do it solely from the spending side. I mean, obviously government should be always looking at the continued justification for spending programs, looking for ways of achieving the aims of those programs more effectively and more efficiently. But I also say things like vacancy controls and efficiency dividends are an ineffectual and ultimately lazy way of achieving that goal.
Saul Eslake's our guest this morning. We're talking about his new report. There's a lot in it. I mean, it chronicles a whole range of ways in which the state could look at improving its financial position. It also looks at some of the taxes and charges that are much lower here than on the mainland and ways in which they might be raised. Steve says via text, maybe get the multinational salmon companies to pay more tax. It's an interesting point. You talk about, how much levies are charged on copper or resource royalties are charged on copper and gold and all sorts of minerals on the mainland. Why don't you talk about sort of resource rent for salmon companies, which are a big part of the Tasmanian economy?
Because it would be constitutionally difficult for a state government to levy an income tax on either individuals or companies. Going back to 1942, when the Curtin government took a monopoly of personal and company income taxes, what was described as a temporary wartime measure, but has been maintained ever since, it is a condition of the grants which Tasmania receives for purposes like schools and hospitals and roads, that it not levy an income tax. You know, that's a power which the federal government has under Section 96 of the Constitution, and it's been upheld in a series of High Court cases over the last 90 years. And a resource rent tax would, I think, be considered by the High Court, because obviously anyone who was subject to it would take it to the High Court as a legal case. It would be ruled by the High Court, I think, as either an income tax or a tax on the production of goods, which would be unconstitutional, whereas mineral royalties, despite the way they're often portrayed by those who have to pay them, are not a tax, but are a price paid by mining companies for their use of the minerals which, under our legal system, are owned by the government on behalf of the people of each state.
So it's a different approach. So it's a huge report. Saul Eslake, good to see you this morning.
Thank you for having me.
On ABC Radio Hobart and ABC Northern Tasmania. Mornings with Leon Compton.